Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our last round segment. Dead or Alive 5, last round. Lobbies on our Friday time. This is, as always, a loser stays on US East Coast lobby. However, we're not too particularly concerned with lag unless it's terrible, so if you're anywhere in the general vicinity, feel free to join us. Well, that is if you are below a certain rank, as this game allows us to filter out people who might be a little too strong for our beginners. We'll be joined shortly by Kanzuki Dynasty and possibly Cosmic Wolf, and move on from there. As you can see, we are using normal health bars this time. And otherwise, everything is more or less the same as last week. Except, of course, that the combatant is slightly different. In that it will not be me playing, but Amar. So you get to see a different character. I'll also have a bit less to say unless or until someone else joins us, as these players are relatively familiar with how to fight each other in this game as well. Those familiar will be looking for Amara's long-range zoning style, which Rachel is actually quite good at, but there are other minor issues, or minor abilities rather, that made this character interesting to her. She has good throws, good evasion, and a particular type of advantage on her normals. It tends to suit Amara's style of play. You do, however, have to have a much clearer idea of where your opponent is going to be when you launch your attacks, as Rachel tends to have shorter buttons most of the time, or relatively linear ones that if the opponent expected them, they would be able to sidestep. A lot of her game plan, therefore, is based around her ability to easily sidestep moves on herself, and good throw range, to make the opponent want to move out of range of things, and then hit them on their way in.
I don't have time to play games with you. Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
One of the strengths involved in that is that while Rachel's moves do not necessarily track superbly well when she's attacking from far enough away and is the aggressor, because of the way they start up, they track relatively well when she is dealing with someone who has only done a single sidestep. Meaning that generally when she sees you sidestep and stop, she's going to assume you're coming for an attack, and even if you aren't, her lunging punch is still effective in that space. The general thing therefore is that if you intend to sidestep to reposition yourself or to try to throw Rachel off, you should generally hold the button so you keep walking.
Get ready, fight!
However, while this can weaken Rachel's zoning related plans, it does not necessarily offer you any advantage in attacking her, so she can simply stay defensive based on knowing that you plan to do this, and find that one of her tracking kicks, as just described, may be enough if you try to move in too close. Therefore, characters with shorter but more effective normals don't often get much advantage from this sidestep, other than being confusing. It's hard to lure a patient Rachel player into making too many mistakes.
Not too bad.
So basically, you try to put as much pressure on her as you can while you're close, and hope that she doesn't counter you and knock you away. She in turn has the strength of being able to twirl out of the way of many attacks to resolve the issue outright.
I challenge you.
I don't have time to play games with you.
Get ready, fight!
And that corner trap has reminded me that last week we discussed the specifics of how to maneuver after managing to get knockdowns with Elliot near the wall or corner. Elliot is a character who generally benefits the most from having his opponent precisely between him and the wall. The opponent, of course, is generally trying to roll away from the wall, but this is not entirely so that they're just not trapped there. It's also partially because many of Elliot's attacks, when done in that way, will put him in worse situations than them. If they manage to counter him, or stay in the right space at all, he's often disadvantaged heavily. Mostly because he cannot be absolutely sure whether or not his opponent wants to move to the side, and therefore have a chance to get out of his wall style attacks, or go straight back in at him. Whereas, once he's got them between himself and the wall, even if they do try to sidestep, there's not much chance of them getting completely out of it. He's also a character that does not fare well in the corner himself, especially against Helena. Meaning that the more time you can spend making sure that he's not near the wall, the better things are.
Now do you understand, my dear? Come and fight.
Good luck.
Get ready, fight!
This game's physics are quite specific. So, on stages like this where there are variable amounts of slope to the floor, being up or downhill can help determine which combos are available to you, or at least how far you are flicked or thrown when you are thrown or hit. This does, however, depend at least somewhat on the move, and therefore you shouldn't always assume that because you are uphill, your opponent will be hit back further than usual. This is actually another part that comes up in understanding Rachel as a character. Part of the way that the lighter characters in this game are treated as weaker in terms of stamina is that when you get good enough to understand a lot of combos in the game, you will find out that there are quite a few that are at least partly character dependent. Rather, what is happening is that they are dependent on the weight class of the character, how high and how long you can juggle the character when doing air moves. Rachel, being a heavyweight character, is harder to juggle, and therefore there are certain combos that don't work on her at all. This does tend to only come up in the cases where you are looking at max damage stuff though. Despite this, she has a relatively quick sidestep, or more accurately, a very sensible one relative to her weight and size compared to other larger characters who tend to be slower in a specific way. So she gets that particular benefit of heavyweight characters without a lot of the movement limitations. That said, since her moves do not tend to involve grappling, and her reach is still not all that great compared to certain others, you still have to play her zoner style. It's just that it helps with her defense when she's actually being hit. It also means that she needs to spend less time repositioning to make sure she is out of bad positions, being either uphill or downhill, and can therefore afford to stay still for much longer than lighter characters can.
I don't have time to play games with you. Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
As you would expect from most zoners, Rachel benefits quite a lot from backdashing in any situation where she thinks the opponent will not be willing to counterattack.
Get ready, fight!
This becomes a good mix-up in that she is able to either keep on hitting them, usually because she's at advantage if she was punching, go for throw, which quite often beats any longer attack that they would have used to chase her down, or can backdash and get a better position for herself. Therefore, it's very important to take advantage of when Rachel is in the corner defending or up against the wall, because she no longer has that ability even if she manages to land her hits. By cutting off some of her options at least,
Get ready, fight!
it becomes easier to decide what to do. She can also backdash or sidewalk out of a lot of things where she has been pushed to max range, meaning that the opponent spends more time making sure that they didn't push her to that range. If anything counted as a weakness directly, is those moments where Rachel gets too close to the opponent, partially by accident, and they have managed to either sidestep or block. As you can see in that situation before, her getting hit by lows in mid-screen are really not too concerning. Therefore, similar to Elliot, Rachel's goal is usually to move toward the middle of the stage rather than to move in on her opponent. After knockdowns anyway. She's not strictly at a disadvantage in narrower or more confined spaces. She just has to play her defense game differently. For example, as you can see here, moving back into the middle of the stage often also opens her up to attack. Meaning you can watch for it, and therefore there's a bit of a mind game in that as well. Rachel does not always want to do this because sometimes she should be expecting you to try to keep her in position and therefore should go for zoning or something similar instead.
The taste of victory.
Deciding which of those is correct is generally a spur of the moment thing.
Good luck.
I'll make sure you regret this.
Get ready, fight!
When one does start to get up to the level of holds, however, Rachel gets another defensive advantage. Generally, at close range, most players only can be certain of being able to hit with a string of mid attacks. Because of the precise spacing that Rachel tends to be at, in that you didn't really open her up, you're punishing her and you don't know exactly how far she is away from you, depending on tons of factors actually. Plus the fact that going for launchers will not always lead to good combos. It is often in her best interest to carefully watch the attack that knocked her out of whatever it was, and just try to hold the most likely next thing. In this game, you can hold attacks that are technically part of strings, even though the first attack has actually hit you. This is often less true if you were staggered very heavily, or if your opponent was using a move at max range, but the general point is that for Rachel this is not the case most of the time. In fact, most people are limited to basically using just their punches, since comboing into their kicks often takes too long. So whereas for many other characters, the question is, do I want to try for a high hold, or do I want to try for kick hold versus punch hold, where both of them are necessarily going to be problems? In Rachel's case, she's normally only deciding between trying for a punch interrupt and her back and hold, which is her mid punch hold. And as a character who normally does not need to do this until she's been hit at least once, it also simplifies that aspect of the game. So once one has learned to time holds as a general thing, it becomes a little easier to deal with these things. The relatively quicker recovery on her kicks also helps,
Great match.
since the speed at which she can activate her hold generally pushes the opponent into doing something relatively silly. Her kicks are long and have hitboxes that prevent people from approaching. Therefore, when they want to whiff punish those kicks, they have to go for usually specific longer range things. These moves are usually, if not completely predictable, of a much smaller set of things than most. Meaning that she can, rather than going for her actual zoning, use her kicks more in that keep out phase of the game, knowing that even if she whiffs them at higher levels of play, she can go for a hold right after them. That said, however, the specifics of the kicks matter quite a lot. So this is a more advanced form of Rachel play that will not necessarily stand up to someone hitting a lot of buttons. On the other hand, once you've managed to convince your opponent to hit a lot of buttons, it becomes really easy to punch them like that.
Get ready, fight!
So they must choose between being in range of her kicks and not being able to really challenge them, or leaving themselves open for huge whiff punishes based on her lunge. Many players, as just demonstrated, will in fact try to just take up the space in front of them, which is what leads to Rachel being able to just go for that lunging punch in situations where otherwise you would not think it was a good idea because she would be unlikely to hit with it. The damage she takes in those situations is usually too small for her to care. Fortunately for the opponent, that move does not necessarily do a lot of damage unless she actually manages to counter hit them in their own movement. And so, it is turned into a direct zoning game. Note of course that Hitomi and Ain are free this week. So we may see some of them.
I'm ready. Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
Take that.
Hitomi going for the quick recovery with her own very quick punch normals. And a lot of head-on attacks in this case. Rachel therefore has a lot of advantage in zoning here because Hitomi is either going to do very blockable strings or whiff some that can be used as something she wants to hit.
Get ready, fight!
Hitomi is not so an easy character to pressure though. And as you know from watching, Amara's general tendency in games like this is to be very cautious around opponents who are doing unfamiliar attacks rather than going in and being daring about it. We have one fight with a very low looking connection, hopefully it resolves itself.
No one can stop me.
Come
Turned out
and
to be Ain in the end anyway.
Get ready, fight!
hard to say exactly how laggy it is, but do note that this game tends to actually physically slow down so you can see when it's lag, and the rollback is not really a thing. So Iron has a similar style to Rachel in that he is relatively easy to sidestep and somewhat easy to interrupt.
Get ready, fight!
He does, however, have a lot more effective combos from specific spacings. And more options that are not based around primarily knocking the opponent away. So he doesn't really have to play the zoning game in the first place. He's also one of the fewer characters that has good, quick punishes from the long situation and from the short, meaning that the standard approach mentioned before with Rachel of just going for it because the opponent probably has to do a mid-punch does not apply to him, as much as he's a punchy character. The good throw range and some of his throw strings, or rather hits into throws, help out with this as well. So she's similarly better off getting away from him and taking advantage of her better spacing there, and either forcing him to come to her, since he has further pushback anyway, or just not pressuring at all, as it doesn't tend to work. But you see, there's a very quick kick, whereas with most players or characters you'd be expecting a punch there and be ready to hold it. A high kick is more of an issue there. And as noted, despite the connections saying it was terrible, I didn't see anything.
I challenge you.
Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
While this game is not one where you normally play for timeout, Rachel is one of the characters most capable of it, simply because the opponent is so reluctant, generally, to move into her space. And she's so good at dodging attacks for long periods when they do, or rather when they try to use their longer ones. Meaning that at this situation, where there's a tournament match for example, there would be no reason to counterattack Elliot at all. He's the one that has to make up the space and the health, and it's very difficult for him to get big damage off of mid-screen conversions, so Rachel just wins by default. Even when she does not have the life lead yet, forcing Elliot to reposition by twirling and standing in specific spots on the screen means that she can set up a situation where she will very likely win soon after by pure damage. This is an advanced technique though, since your opponent could just sidestep very quickly in one direction and decide to stay there. But this sort of situation is what we're talking about. Eventually, if you are patient enough, you will move the opponent to a position that is disadvantageous to them. And from there, it's just a matter of awareness. Learning which buttons to use to fill space helps a lot with the process, as there are certain of Rachel's moves that move her forward, and others that look like those moves that don't, meaning the opponent does not know whether or not to attempt to be punished based on the initial information they get. Her kicks are often in this line of options she has for this. Since she also retracts the hurt box on her kicks at a timing that if you didn't catch her quite right, now you are in her space.
I'll defeat anyone!
I don't have time to play games with you. Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
One of the other things you'll often pick up in this game is that raw hits of a particular type are not actually that hard to hold. The reason it becomes harder is because if you get counter hit, you take longer to recover from the hit, making the hold not only a worse idea, simply because you don't have as much time, but trying to hold will often get you hit again because of various aspects of it, sometimes thrown. Generally, therefore, you want to hold after you are messed up an attack and are being punished, rather than holding because you got counter hit and were out of the way of something. Generally, this is also true for the faster attacks your opponent uses when they're trying to open you up in a standard match. If you get hit by these, you can still hold the follow-up attack, but you must be absolutely ready for it from the very beginning. Therefore, the easiest way to remember this situation is only allow yourself to go for the hold as a beginner after you have been hit once for missing. If you learn to associate missing your attacks with holding your opponent's counterattack, you may have a better chance. This even applies to when you are the one going for a punish. If you go for a punish that misses, it can be hard to tell what exactly to hit because you no longer have the capacity to target your own attack. However, holds don't care enough about this to matter. They can always be executed in more or less the same timing and spacing. So a punish that you have missed means it is generally a good time to go for your standard mid-hold.
Get ready, fight!
I challenge you.
Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
So let's look at the I'm not moving, you have to come to me style of doing this. If you leave yourself open by making attacks at certain ranges, the opponent will generally just come straight at you. They have no reason not to. But you can throw them off more by being in that position than most positions. This is because their spacing gets messed up afterwards.
Get ready, fight!
Since her lunging punch is more or less not reactable at the point where the opponent has just made a movement, by most players, since they don't necessarily know if it will hit them or if it is even necessarily going to be the attack, you can get out of the way of a lot of situations by feinting that you're going to do it, as she does have some moves that look like she will, cause him to flinch and block, and then just doing it when they move.
Get ready, fight!
Giving the impression that you are ready to or willing to do this move is akin to the fake fireballs that they gave Ryu back in Street Fighter HD Remix. He also had it, I believe, in Alpha 2. I seem to remember using it a lot there, but not 3. It's a very stressful move, and similarly, it's quite stressful when Rachel does similar things. A more daring opponent with a good understanding of their own spacing, or an advantageous spacing with their character, will just counterattack anyway. But that sort of player is not the player you were worried about when you were thinking of someone who you need to keep very far away from you. This match is just playing out the same problem as mentioned before. This is literally a boxing ring, and therefore the corners are always close by and very predictable and obvious, meaning that Helena constantly has a very clear idea of where in relation to the corner she is and where Elliot is. Therefore, how to hold advantage, how to avoid his attacks, and how to make sure she doesn't get held herself.
Now do you understand, my dear?
We did see some Honoko last week. The main thing to understand about this character is that her approaches are linear, and she often tries to stick to you really long because her approaches are linear and she doesn't want to have to approach. So staying relatively far away and expecting to either sidestep, hold, or use a move that will do something similar is a good way of dealing with her as a whole. If she can get you near a corner though, there's very little you can do about it. So your ability to do it through holes becomes more important. Once you're far enough away though, just don't get hit. That's basically all you have to understand. Being ready to whiff punish, often with a grab, is a decent way to deal with her, but she does have a lot of good options for moves that become difficult to punish with grabs. And once she does get started off her own stronger with punishes, you don't get to do too much, as demonstrated here. Meaning even more reason to not try to challenge Honoka in neutral too much. Stay out of her way, stay off to the side, and if you must use a move to try to keep her out, make sure it's one of your like most direct forward or upward kicks, as you see being used here, so that if you whiff, she can't necessarily hit you all that hard or that much. A lot of what she can do is based on making sure to get a max range version of a particular thing started so that she can keep going from there. We can see the lag coming through in this match though. Although honestly, it's hard to say whose side that's on. She's also not all that great at dealing with hopping or leaping attacks. Not specifically because any of her buttons don't deal with the problem, but rather that it's a little bit too hard for her to gather anything off it if she does manage to hit you. Most characters with this sort of strong, very fast mid-hit game don't benefit too much from landing the hits on someone who was jumping at them because of a bunch of interactions the game has in general. Therefore, if you must approach Honoka and you feel it's time to go in for the kill or something, do your best to go for that. If your character does not have a good hop response, there's not a lot you can do directly. Generally, you sit quietly and hope that she doesn't manage to trick you into getting hit. And once you do get hit, just try not to panic too much about your life bar disappearing. Okay, as noted, wasn't sure which side the lag was on, and now it's a little clearer. So it looks like the wolf net has gone to hell for at least a moment. Oh, no, there we go. It's in betweenish. But it normally resolves itself after a little bit, so let's hope it does. And hope that the match with Honoka was not too terrible as a result of it, even though it looked pretty bad. As you'll know the difference here, Rachel moves in this case, and as long as Rachel is moving, Elliot has advantage. Rachel doesn't have to move though. She can take much more hits and gains much more from that stress and intimidation than Elliot does. In fact, if he gets too far away, as just been demonstrated, her lunging punch is a good way to set up something else, rather than actually fighting at all by trying to hit with it. She can purposely freak out the opponent and then do the punch from too far away intentionally. The sweet spot between expecting the opponent to do the right thing because you have thrown out this move before, and expecting them to do the wrong thing because they think you're closer than you are, is something you learn after years of zoning. And in 3D games, this is as close to zoning as most characters get. Another important point is that even if Rachel does not necessarily want to move forward, she can often find some time to find literally the most optimal point in the stage for herself to be standing at. And the opponent can't necessarily do too much about it while she does it. Having that position then makes the opponent more and more worried. And then all she has to do is use her, I think it's down punch, to fake the idea that she's going to go for the lunging one. I say down punch because down punch and down forward punch might be different, and I was just hitting, okay, probably down forward punch. But understanding that you have changed your opponent's mindset is equally useful, because as soon as you have done so, there we go, yeah, says it. Changing your opponent's mindset means that you should now change your strategy, but recognizing when you've done it can be a little bit difficult. Therefore, every time you run yourself into a situation where you have finally managed to land the thing you were setting up, ask yourself, if you were in your opponent's position, what would you be thinking right then? And if not necessarily in your opponent's position, ask someone with a similar playstyle or mental state what they would do. We saw a little Hayabusa last week as well.
Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
Hayabusa's main strength is that he has long attacks that aren't too linear, but they also don't have a lot of variation in them. Therefore, if you get a good read on a Hayabusa player, you're generally waiting on the fact that the character is relatively strong in terms of top tier or whatever, but he tends to put himself in bad situations if your defense is good. So you don't have to worry too much about it from there. And here we have suffering the same thing with the down forward punch, I presume. Faking the fact that Rachel is going to go for the lunge, making it easier to deal with certain things. At certain ranges, it is actually going to hit, making it even more complicated. As the opponent can't just decide, I'm going to move here or there. Against Rachel, however, Hayabusa is one of the better characters for dealing with when she whiffs the lunge punch entirely. Meaning that she has to be a little bit more careful with him in terms of whether or not she actually hits him with it. Whiffing leads to him using his long, strong punishes, which don't require a lot of specific position from the opponent. He will just keep on hitting them, or just do a sequence that does the entire job for him relatively easily without worrying too much about it.
Justice wins.
Face your fate. Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
Helena is also not a character that does a supremely good job advancing on Rachel because unlike most people who have very linear forward attacks, Rachel has kicks that basically act as either axe kicks or large sweeping slicing kicks, making it easier for her to trap Helena and stop her from approaching. This is generally only true from far away though.
Get ready, fight!
Once Helena manages to get a little closer and starts the sidestep game, or her leaping attacks, Rachel has a bit more trouble dealing with it.
Get ready, fight!
It can be hard when you have the instinct to move in on a downed opponent to get rid of that instinct in fighting games. It's particularly hard in DOA because there's really not much else to be doing. However, if you think enough about your sidestep game, you might be able to come up with some more optimal positions to be in rather than just closer.
Get ready, fight!
Despite Rachel's relatively good throw game, for example, she doesn't really have a lot of good follow-ups to the throws, and generally, like everything else she does in those spacings, she should backdash. Her back throw is much better. But still not necessarily a pressure thing that she'd want to set up. It's just that you often can because your opponent is facing the other way and is less likely to get up a particular way.
Come and fight.
But you have told me again. Hitomi's relatively linear forward attacks often mean that Rachel's down forward punch makes it easy to get through her, allowing her to be more aggressive than usual. In a closed round space like this, it's also easier to hold control of the situation.
Not too bad.
Helena has similar abilities against Hitomi specifically, but it takes a bit longer for her to get started, given that, unlike Rachel, when she hits her standard punches in neutral just to get some pressure and assumes that Hitomi may block it, she will end up in a different position and have a little bit more trouble recovering from there if Hitomi was blocking.
I don't have time to play
She also
games
does not have a move that goes under things as easily.
Get ready, fight!
While she even has a complete low stance, moving into that low stance while Hitomi is on the offense is a lot harder than it is for Rachel. However, at that range, you can see that she does have at least one attack she can use for it. If Helena can manage to get far enough away to get into her back stance, she's almost impossible for Hitomi style characters to approach. This is not really true for Ayane, but at the moment, we know that our player was playing Hitomi before, so... Helena's back stance is more so her defense stance, because her moves are more likely to collide with or defeat the opponents. Outright, rather than having to punish them.
Get ready, fight!
The low strike you've been seeing, however, is still good at dealing with players who want to move in from that longer range with their punch buttons. Generally, it is not so easy to hold out most of the characters in this game by using your punches to fill space in front of you. Generally, if you want to hold the opponent out, you are looking at using the same sort of jab style attack, but it would normally need to go low, and you're looking for the one that does the twirliest thing on the ground, basically.
Come and fight. Let's see how strong you are.
Get ready, fight!
In Rachel's case, therefore, this is still the same down forward punch she was using all the rest of the time. Ayane is relatively easy to zone because she has to do one move before she gets into the position to do almost all of her good links. Or, links is probably the wrong word. But there's a lot of stuff Ayane wants to do that requires her to do another strike or whiff first, which normally brings her a little bit closer. If she isn't managing to get close and threaten with those things to begin with, then Rachel has a much easier time than most characters holding her off. As you can see there, she is trying to get a mix-up or a setup, but this involves often turning and or whiffing in front of you, which is something that Rachel as a character generally deals with well. Ayane is able to do things like this, but the damage of this is generally small over time. So Rachel's general aim is to keep her far enough away that she has to go for something and then just hit her whenever she tries to do something to lead in. Making sure that you're never too close to Ayane is probably the fundamental part of this matchup. As with most rushdown characters, zoning her is a matter of patience and a lot of confidence in the ability to do certain things. When she is close, you're in a lot of trouble, so try to stay in that space mentally. Since she also has so many varied attacks, it's hard to really be sure of what you should do in terms of holds. Meaning that you still have to spend even more time getting your zoning right. As noted here, actually making any approach at all is probably a bad idea because Ayane benefits more from you moving closer in every situation than you do from moving closer to her. Even the slightest step forward normally will put you in a range where she can very quickly do a move and follow up from it.
You're pretty good. For a human.
However, with her general speed, it's difficult to move completely out of the way since you will end up proximity blocking a lot. Therefore, most of this fight is awareness and confidence in your buttons. She's not a really easy character to beat when you're just starting out or don't understand what it is that your character can do. Because as soon as she's close, you have to deal with all this. And trying to get out of the way of it never works because she's just too fast in terms of her own attacks. In Rachel's case, often even if she got out of the way with the twirl, Ayane's heavy ability to do tracking moves would mean that she wouldn't end up getting any advantage at all. Fortunately for Rachel, this is the same as Hitomi. When Ayane is sorta close but not quite, the down forward punch is the answer to basically everything.
Good luck.
Come and fight.
Get ready, fight!
The down forward punch is not as effective against Elliot at all. Same way it's not that effective against Kasumi. His attacks tend to hit toward the low side, or start from there, meaning that it's a lot easier for that situation to turn out bad for Rachel. Well, it looks like whatever the wolf attempted to do to fix the net is not quite working out okay, but it's not that bad, honestly. This is just around the place where we normally ask people to not to bother. So hopefully it will clear up, at least in this one. Hopefully this isn't someone on our side, but we'd have to fight at least one more person to find out. In this case, it's technically easier to win.
Face your fate.
I challenge you.
Get ready, fight!
So this will probably give us our information, and then we can decide whether or not to continue the stream. Chances are we're going to close it up.
Well, we definitely have a lag on this match too. How does one do that? Critical, I think.
Different for everyone.
Ah.
Get ready, fight!
Well, these streams normally last 2 hours, but it looks like tonight we're going to have a lighter time anyway, so we will in fact be closing up stream after this match. Join us next week, Monday, for our usual Monday mishmashing battle lounge in Street Fighter 5, and on Tuesday for the Tuesday train, Guilty Gear Zard Red 2. On Wednesday, we're most likely having more Street Fighter content of some other kind. Possibly progress from the last Sandbag Casuals, and possibly something entirely new, but probably still Sandbag Casuals. Expect Thursday to be, once again, Kame House, Dragon Ball FighterZ Beginner's Lobby, and Friday we will either have some form of bot content or back to more last round. So, with that said, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good night, everyone.